For Flutter, I mentioned that one important part would be that we add this authentication screen. And since this is a rather complex screen, and I don't want to waste too much time on building yet another UI and widget tree, I attached a file to this lecture here, the auth-screen-dart file, which you simply can drag and drop into that screen folder. Now, of course, I'll walk you through that file, no worries. I'll explain what happens in there, what I built in there. But add that file to your screens folder, and then let's have a look at it. In that file, I import Dart Moth, you'll see why in a second. I import material Dart, of course, and I set up my own enum, which I'll basically use to switch between two different auth modes that will influence on which kind of form we're showing. We're either signing up or we're logging in, and depending on the mode that was chosen, we have a different label on the button. We also show an extra confirm password input in sign up mode. Things like that change, and for that I use an enum down in the code. Then we have the off-screen class here, which is a stateless widget. I have a route name, my static const route name here, so that we can register this in the route table, which we'll do in a second. Then the build method, and in there I just fetch my device size from media query auth context size. We did this earlier in the course too. Then here we have scaffold widget with a stack widget as a body. We learned about the stack as well. It allows you to place items on top of each other in a three-dimensional space, basically. And then the bottommost widget here is a container, which actually has a box decoration that sets up a linear gradient. I also covered linear gradients earlier. This basically allows you to create a gradient between two colors, and these are simply two such colors. Basically a linear gradient as we used it before. And then the other itemized stack above the gradient basically is a single child scroll view with a container inside of it, which I simply use to configure the height and the width to take the full device height and width. And in there, a column. And that column here has centered content, as you can tell, to center the authentication form in the middle, as you will soon see. And then there, in my children, I have a flexible wrapper around a container, which basically displays a little title. The title, my shop. You could use any title you want. But if I scroll up a bit, you see there's something interesting. Besides a margin and a padding, I do this. I have the transform argument there and then this strange code. And we have seen neither of that. Now, transform is an argument which the container supports out of the box, which allows you to transform how that container is presented. It allows you to rotate the container, to scale it, or to move it. Of course, it has a certain position on the screen, and with transform, you could also offset it by a certain amount on either axis. Now, what's this code here? This configures how this container should be transformed. And if you hover over transform, you see that transform takes a matrix4 object. Matrix4 is a class built into Flutter, provided by the material Dart file. And in the end, it's an object that describes the transformation of a container. Matrix4 simply allows you to describe rotation, scaling, and offset of a container all in one object. So it's a big bundle of information that contains information about how to position and change, transform that container. Now to configure that, I use the rotation set constructor here, which constructs a new matrix4 object, as you can see here. And this object has a certain rotation. Here I use pi, and pi is provided by the Dart Moth package, which is the number pi, 3.14, and so on. And I use pi here to calculate a rotation, basically, a slight angle by which I want to rotate this. Rotation Z means that I rotate along the Z axis. If we have a look at our device, then we have three axes there. The X axis is left to right, Y axis top to bottom, and the Z axis is basically into the device. So if you're holding the phone in your hand, the Z axis would be from your eyes through the device, right? So into the device in three-dimensional space. Now this spinner here is rotating around the Z axis. If I place my mouse here in the middle of it, then you could imagine that the Z axis goes through the device at the point where my mouse is placed. So it's going from your face through the device, and this circle is spinning around that axis. If you imagine the axis like a stick you stick into the phone, then the spinner would go around it. It would rotate around the Z axis. So if you rotate something around the z-axis, that means you don't create a 3D effect, which you would do if you rotate around the y or x-axis, because that would always rotate the element such that it feels like it's coming out of the screen. Instead, it keeps the two-dimensional look, but it's simply shifted a bit. It gets a slight angle, and you'll see how it works in a second, of course, once we see that screen. Now, what's strange here is this ... translate syntax, though. This is a syntax we haven't seen before in the course. We know that we can, of course, chain method calls together. For example, here I can add a dot, and then here I could call translate. So the matrix for object, which rotation set returns, has a translate method, as it seems. Now, I'm doing this translate call here basically because I don't just want to rotate this, I also want to offset it a little bit. And translate is a method that offsets the object, or that adds some offsetting configuration to the matrix for object. The problem with translate just is, translate does not return a new matrix for object, but it returns void. So if I call .translate here, and I pass my argument like -10 in here, then here, this overall chain, if we comment this out, this overall chain removes void. Transform doesn't want void though, it wants a matrix for object. And this chain doesn't return a matrix for object anymore, because this here returns basically what the last method in the chain returns, and that is void. The ... operator fixes that. It's a special operator which Dart has, not every programming language has that, and the ... operator basically calls translate on that object, but does then not return what translate would return, but it returns what the previous statement returned, so what rotation set returned. And the longer form of writing this, to make that really clear, would be that up here, for example, you create your transform config, whatever you want to name it, and there you call matrix for rotation set with the value we have down there. So let's say, grab this value we have there. So now we have a matrix for object which is configured to rotate, and now we could use transform config and call translate on that and add -10.0. Now translate is simply a method that does not return a new object, but that edits the object on which it is called. And we of course have similar things in our app. For example, in the product start file, we have in the end a products class here. And all the methods we have in there, like fetch and set products, don't return new or updated versions of this products class. They instead change the products class from inside. Here, for example, in the end, we override the items property of the products class. So here we are changing our object from inside, and translate does the exact same thing. It changes the matrix for object on which you call it from inside. Now that's fine here, where we store this in a variable, and then in a second line we call something on that variable, and therefore the value stored in the variable is still the same object, but now also with that change taken into account. And you could use that transform config down there as a value for transform, and it would work. There's nothing wrong with doing it like this, but to avoid having to set this up there across multiple lines, you can use this double dot notation, because this basically allows you to have a statement that would normally take a variable and 2 lines of code in 1 line without a variable, because you don't return what translate returns, but you instead return what the previous method returned, in this case what this constructor returned, which is a matrix for object, and then you just execute this on this object before it is actually used here in the argument. So you added an object in memory just as if it were stored in a variable, which you now call something on to edit it. And then this edited object is returned here, but you don't return what translate would return. That's what the cascade operator, as it is called, does. It simply is a replacement for having an extra variable and multiple lines of code just to set something up and then call something on it and then use the originally set up object. There was a lot of talking about this, but it is important to understand the syntax. Other than that, here is nothing spectacular. Just a little bit of box shadow setup, then a title here with a font, the Anton font, which we already added earlier, and that's it. Almost. Down there, I'm rendering another widget, the off-card widget. The off-card widget resides in the same file, and this is a stateful widget. It's a stateful widget which holds the authentication form. Hence here I set up my form key, I also control the off mode we're currently in, because this class here, this widget here, also has a button to switch between the two off modes, switch between sign up and log in. I have is loading here so that we can, that should be a var, so that we can control whether we're currently loading or not, and show a loading spinner if appropriate. And I have an extra password controller in here, which you'll see in a second why I have it here. This is of course connected to my password form field, which you'll find below. Here we have the submit method, which will eventually be called. We are doing validation, and if validation fails, we just return and don't continue. If we do continue, so if validation succeeded, we save all inputs, which you learned will trigger the onSaved method on the inputs. And then in the end here, we're setting the loading spinner. Here's a snippet or a part where we have to add code to then send a login or a sign up request based on which mode we're in. And that's it. Then I have another method, switch off mode, which basically switches from login to sign up mode or the other way around and reflects that in the UI by calling setState. And if we go down further, we have the build method. There, again, I get the device size. Below that, I have the card with rounded borders with the built-in rounded rectangle border shape or class, which I use here as a value for the shape. Then the container here, some height assigned to the container. The height depends on the off mode because I have to increase the container in height if we also render an extra confirm password field. Then we have the form down there with our form key. It's scrollable, has a column in there because we have multiple inputs. And then here I have my text form field for the email with some basic validation that simply checks whether there's an @ symbol in the email or not. Of course, having an @ doesn't automatically make that a valid email. You could use more complex regular expression validation here if you wanted to, but I wanted to keep this code short and concise. Then here's the onSaved method, which saves the value the user entered in an auth data map in the end. It's this map we have up there. So here I save the entered email and password in the end. If we go down further, here's the password input field where I check that it's at least 6 characters long and not empty, of course. And here the password text editing controller is assigned to. And this controller is used in conjunction with the last text form field, which is only rendered if we're in sign up mode. So not when we're logging in, but if we're signing up, because there users should confirm the password. And here, by the way, also on the other password field, I have obscure text set to true, which makes sure that the input isn't shown to the user, but we have some stars masking the user input. That's an important side note. But back to the text editing controller. Here in the validation of the confirm password text form field, there I check whether the value entered into this form field is equal to the value entered in the other password field. So that only if these two are equal, this field here is treated as valid. And with that, sized box for some spacing, potentially we show a loading indicator, or alternatively, if we're not loading, I show a button which either shows login or sign up as a label, depending on the mode that was chosen by the user. And the button has some rounded corners here, something you can set up on a raised button here with the shape argument. Some padding, a color, a text color, and that's it. This button will in the end, when we press it, call the submit method. We also have a second button, a flat button, below the submit button here, which allows you to switch between sign up and login mode. The label of the button changes appropriately to tell you what you change to. It triggers the switch off mode function or method, which I have up there. And I have material tab target size set up here to basically just shrink the button a little bit. This will, you could say, reduce the amount of surface you can hit with your finger to trigger that button. It will still be large enough, but it simply makes it a bit smaller and look nicer in my opinion. That is the off screen. Besides the things I explained, nothing we haven't used thus far. Let's now register it in our routes table and also make it our home route. Because for now, that should be the main screen users see when they enter our app, because users do have to authenticate before they can start using the app. So here in the main Dart file, we can simply import from the screens folder and import that off-screen Dart file. And with that, we can go down there and here, make that our home screen, the off screen. And therefore, actually, we don't even need to add it to the routes table. So here, that's the off screen. If you now save this and start this app on your emulator, you should see that this off screen is the first thing that's presented to you in that app. So let's wait for that to restart and have a look at that. Here it is. This is the off screen. This is basically what this off-screen Dart file, which I gave you, renders. This is the transform title with that slide rotation. Feel free, of course, to play around with the values set up there in the transform setup there to see how that changes the look. And this is the off card, this form here. In login mode, which is the default, we see email and password. If we go to sign up, we see confirm password as well. So this is what we have there. Now let's make sure that users can sign up.